This afternoon, in our first study, we looked at scientific evidence for the fact that dinosaurs are dragons, and we looked at some archaeological evidence as well. Various sites all around the world, different times, different cultures, all depicting what look like dinosaurs to us, but are in fact dragons. This afternoon, we want to have a look at the Bible in this study, the biblical case as to why dragons coexisted with man. And then in the third study that you just heard about, if you're still up for some more, we'll consider the historical accounts from famous historians, including Josephus and Herodotus, some more archaeological evidence of sites and artefacts, places around the world with dragon inscriptions, tapestries, carvings, and we'll consider some of the most famous dragon legends. So let's get into the biblical evidence for dinosaurs being dragons. Now, as we said in the first study from the outset, it's true that the word dinosaur does not appear in the Bible. And that's because the King James Version of the Bible was printed in 1611. But the word dinosaur was coined some 200 years later, in 1841, by Sir Richard Owen. And he derived it from the Greek word meaning terrible lizard. So whenever you read about a dinosaur, it's got they've got the name saur, a brachiosaur or something a saur, right? A pterosaur. The saur means a lizard, or the saurus means a lizard. So dina in this case means terrible. So a terrible lizard, and he did that after seeing the fossil bones of a iguanodon and a megalosaurus. Again, there's the word saur in megalosaurus, some type of lizard. But the point is, before 1841, history books and scientists called these creatures dragons. And you will find the word dragon in the Bible, particularly the King James Bible. Now, it's unfortunate that some of the modern translations, including the NIV, have fallen susceptible to the evolutionary worldview and replaced a lot of the times translated the word jackal instead of dragon. And we're going to see why that's wrong. Now, the first occurrence in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, which we read in our first study this afternoon, where we read that God created the great sea monsters. And the King James Bible has whales. It's the word tannin, or tannim, the plural form of it. And here's a version from the Latin Vulgate, which is translated into English from the 5th century, and it has just translated it directly. So God created the great dragons. Now, dinosaurs in the Bible, the word tannim, it's the Hebrew word tannim in the King James Bible. It occurs 28 times. According to Strong's, it means a marine or land monster. Okay, that's important, because when you see the context of how this word is used, sometimes it's in a water creature, sometimes it's a creature on land. On the simplest way, I think, to describe this, it's talking about a monster is the easiest way to think about it. A monster in the sea or a monster on land. Gesenius says it's a sea monster, a vast fish, a serpent, a dragon, a crocodile. And Brown Driver Briggs says it's a dragon or dinosaur, a sea or river monster, a serpent, a venomous snake. And so the point again is that this word tannim is used to describe certain creatures both on the land and in the water. Now, if we look at all the occurrences in the King James Bible, we see it comes out a total of 28 times, the word tannim. We have 15 occurrences of the word dragons, plural. 6 times it's dragon in singular. 1 time it is translated monsters in Lamentations 4 verse 3 as a monster. Two times it's translated as a serpent. We're going to look at these occasions. And one time as serpents, plural. Two times we have whales, singular, in Job and Ezekiel. And then in Genesis chapter 1, whales, plural. And so again, you get the picture. It's in Hebrew, it's one word, okay? It's like when we say that nephesh is one word. It's translated various ways, isn't it? Soul, heart, mind, body. Okay? Well, it's the same with tanim. It's just one word in the Hebrew, but it's being translated by different words. But what's clear is it's a creature that can be in the water or on the land. So again, I think the best way to simply describe it is it's a monster. Okay? A great big creature is the way the Bible's describing it, either in the water or on land. And then the root word, which is tan, occurs twice as well. It's the Strong says it's from an unused root, probably meaning to elongate, a monster. That is a sea serpent or another huge marine animal, and also a jackal, and that's based on the various translations which say it's a jackal. But we'll look at that in a minute. Again, for this word, Brown Driver Briggs says it's a dragon, maybe the extinct dinosaur, the plesiosaurus, or the whale. Okay, now there's an honest assessment. And this word occurs once as a dragon, in Malachi 1 verse 3 as a land creature, and then in Ezekiel 32 verse 2 as a sea creature. So the same point here. Okay, so 2 occasions of the word tan, 28 occurrences of the word tanim. So in all we've got 30 occasions. Okay, now has anyone got an NIV? Does anyone use a modern translation? Because when we read these verses you'll often come across the word jackal instead of a dragon. Now, one example here is in Malachi chapter 1 verse 3, where the King James Bible says, I hated Esau and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. But in the NIV it says, Esau have I hated, and I've turned his hill country into wasteland and left his inheritance to the desert jackals. Okay, now what's right? Well, if jackals is a correct translation of tannin, the problem is the same word is used to refer to sea creatures and serpents as well. For example, in Isaiah 27 verse 1, it says, in the day that the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. Or what does the NIV do with that? Well, conveniently they've said, well, it's obviously not a jackal. A jackal can't live in the sea, can it? So you can see that they're translating the word tannin here as a monster. Okay, so there's really no basis for the NIV and other modern translations translating it as a jackal. If we look at the occasions that the word tannin refers to land creatures or land dragons, we can see that it's not some symbolic creature. It's actually talking about a real creature because it's often mentioned with other real animals. In Job 30 verse 29, I am become a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. Okay? It's not symbology here. Okay? It's clearly a literal animal because the fact is it's used in conjunction with another real animal. The same point, Psalm 91 verse 13. Thou shalt tread upon the lion and the adder, the young lion and the dragon. So we have young lions and dragons in the same verse. Isaiah 43 verse 20. The beasts of the field shall honour me, the dragons and the owls, because I give waters in the wilderness and rivers in the desert to drink to my people, my chosen. So, again, it's talking about real animals. Micah 1 verse 8, we have it again. The mentioning of dragons together with owls. I will make a wailing like the dragons and mourning as the owls. Now, the other consistent aspect that we find, that when we look at the occurrence of this word tannin, when we look at it, the Bible describes them as dwelling in a solitary place all the time, somewhere far away from normal civilization. They tend to dwell in deserted areas, okay, where humans normally don't live. So we read in Psalm 44 verse 19, "Though thou hast sore broken us in the place of dragons and covered us with the shadow of death." So the place of dragons is somewhere where you don't want to be. It's far away. Isaiah 13 verses 19 to 22, speaking about what's going to happen to Babylon. Okay, and how it will become a desolation. Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited. But the wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and owls shall dwell there. Remember, we just looked at that. Owls and dragons are often together. And satyrs shall dance there. And the wild beasts of the island shall cry in their desolate houses, and dragons in their pleasant places. So Babylon, the prophecy here would become a place where wild beasts would live, including dragons. Isaiah 34, "And thorns shall come up in her palaces, nettles and brambles in the fortresses thereof, and it shall be an habitation of dragons and a court for owls." Okay, a deserted palace, a deserted place where people no longer live. Then dragons are found living in these type of places. Isaiah 35 verse 7, "And the parched ground shall become a pool." This is a vision of the kingdom, isn't it? Isaiah 35, "And the thirsty land springs of water. And in the habitation of dragons, where it lay, shall be grass with reeds and rushes." So the deserted place will no longer be there. The place where dragons used to live, in a desert place, well, in those places in the kingdom, there's going to be grass with reeds and rushes. You get the point? There's more. In the book of Jeremiah, we have copious references to this fact. Prophecies about what's going to happen to Jerusalem. Jerusalem will become a heaps, a den of dragons, and I will make the city of Judah desolate. Chapter 10, verse 22. Again, to make the cities of Judah desolate and a den of dragons. Jeremiah 49, verse 33. "Hazor shall be a dwelling for dragons, and a desolation forever." Jeremiah 51, "And Babylon shall become heaps, a dwelling place for dragons, an astonishment, a hissing without an inhabitant." That verse is important because, I don't think jackals hiss. But dragons do. A serpent creature does make a hiss. Right? Babylon shall become a dwelling place for dragons. And then Malachi chapter 1 verse 3, "I hated Esau and laid his mountain and his heritage waste for the dragons, for the dragons of the wilderness." So the other thing we want to establish here is that, now we've talked about the land creatures, well, what about the marine dragons, okay, in the sea? And when we look at the occasions on which they occur in the scriptures, it's evident as well. It's talking about a real animal. We read that from Genesis chapter 1 verse 21, God created the great whales, okay? Other translations have it as the great sea monsters. Psalm 148 will come up. Here we are. Psalm 148 verse 7. "Praise the Lord from the earth, ye dragons, and all ye deep, and all ye deeps." So the context there is in Psalm, praise the Lord, everything that is in the water, everything that is in the deep, including the dragons. Lamentations 4 verse 3. "Even the sea monsters draw out the beast. They give suck to their young ones. The daughter of my people is become cruel. like the ostriches in the wilderness. Now, it's the same word, tannin. Okay? But what's very interesting about this verse is it says that the sea monsters draw out the beast. So, in Lamentations 4 verse 3, that verse there, even the sea monsters, they draw out the beast. Clearly, they draw out the breast. Clearly, that has to be referring to a mammal. Okay? It can't be referring to a reptile, because reptiles lay eggs. Mammals, right, have babies like humans. And the mother feeds them with her milk. But here's the Bible telling us that the sea monsters, the creatures in the sea, these great creatures, they draw out the breast and give suck to their young. Now, it's interesting that the common sea creature of a dragon is called a plesiosaur, right? A plesiosaur. We looked at the Aborigine painting of one before in the earlier session. Now, it's got the name saurus in it, hasn't it? Which means a lizard. So, from a long time, the scientists believe that this is a reptile. It's not a mammal. That's what they've always believed. But look what happened recently. And here's something that made news in 2011, that they found out that the plesiosaurs carried the young like a mammal. Okay, is their latest finding. Okay, so it reads, plesiosaurs, giant marine reptiles that ruled the ocean 75 million years ago, gave birth to single large babies and maybe even nurtured their young according to a new study. Okay, so here's the artist's depiction of the plesiosaur giving birth to its young, what would you call it, a calf? Who's the biology expert here? So, like a whale as well, okay? So, before they thought it was a reptile and laid eggs, but now the more they study things, the more they're finding, oh, actually we were wrong. Okay, this creature's actually a mammal. And this confirms the accuracy of what we just read in the Bible. That these sea monsters draw out the breast for their young. Okay, so isn't that amazing? So science changes all the time. They're continually changing their story about things. But the Bible's got it right from the beginning. Psalm 74, it says in verse 12, "For God is my King of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You didst divide the sea by thy strength. You broke the head of the dragon in the waters. You broke the head of the Leviathan in pieces and gave him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness." Now, note what's going on here. What's going on here? This is talking about what the wondrous works that God did in delivering Israel out of Egypt. And he's pointing to two things that are wonderful, two things that are humanly impossible. The first thing God did was he divided the waters so that the children of Israel could walk through. The second thing he did that man cannot do is he broke the head of the dragons in the waters. And he gave it to meat for the people. Okay? Now, if that's impossible to do, just like it's impossible for man to divide the waters, then this had to be a huge creature, okay, that God destroyed and gave it to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. So this is one of these little bits of additional information we learn in the Psalms about what happened when the children of Israel came out of Egypt. Isaiah 51 verse 9, "Awake, awake, put on thy strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Art thou not it that hath cut Rahab," which is a name meaning pride, "and wounded the dragon? Art thou not it which dried the sea, the waters of the great deep, that made the depths of the sea a way for the ransom to pass over?" So again, okay, you've got the same point being made here in Isaiah, that God did two great things, okay? He wounded the dragon, he destroyed the dragon, and he made a way through the sea for the people to walk. Now, often in other places you can say that that's symbolic language, that Rahab and the dragon, God destroyed them. It's speaking about sin. It's speaking about the destruction of Egypt. That's true. but it's based on something that literally occurred. Okay, so the symbology is based on an actual event that occurred. And so there's many other verses in the Bible that are along those lines. The symbology is based on reality. So Isaiah 27 verse 1, we have the words that in that day Yahweh with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan the piercing serpent, even Leviathan that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. Now this may be applying, okay, in a symbolic sense, okay, to the nations. But it's based on something that actually occurred literally. It's based on real animals. Ezekiel 29 verse 3 says, "Speak and say, Thus saith Yahweh the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, Pharaoh king of Egypt, the great dragon." Okay, so Pharaoh's aligned with a dragon. Okay, but again, it's symbology that's based on a literal animal. Ezekiel 32 verse 2, "Son of man, take up a lamentation for Pharaoh king of Egypt, and say unto him, Thou art like a young lion of the nations. Thou art as a whale in the seas." Okay, now here's the same word tannin, okay? But the translator on this occasion, the King James Version, haven't used the word dragon, they've used the word whale. Now it's symbolic, isn't it? Obviously it's a symbolic verse, but here they've used the word whale. Now just like whale is a real animal and it's got a symbolic application, so in these verses we're looking at here, dragon is a real animal, but it's being used as in a symbolic sense to represent Egypt and other nations. Jeremiah 51 verse 34 says, Jeremiah 31 verse 54, "Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon hath devoured me, he hath crushed me, he hath made me an empty vessel, he hath swallowed me up like a dragon, he hath filled his belly with my delicacies, he hath cast me out." Okay, so obviously that's symbology, but for a dragon it's talking about a huge beast that literally could swallow you up. Okay, that literally could do that. And Jeremiah in his prophecy is saying that's what Nebuchadnezzar has done to Israel. He's crushed them, he's made them like an empty vessel, he's swallowed them up like a dragon. Just in a moment, and there's nothing you can do about it because the dragon is so strong. Okay, now let's come to another interesting usage of the word of tannin, and that's in Exodus chapter 7 and verse 8 to 12. And this is the occasion when Moses and Aaron went into Pharaoh's court and were asked, to ask Pharaoh, "Let my people go. The children of Israel, it's time for them to leave Egypt." Okay, and we know that God gave them some signs that they could prove to Pharaoh that God was with them. And one of them, of course, was the rod that Moses held, that if he threw it on the ground, it would turn into a serpent. So Exodus chapter 7 from verse 8, we read, "And Yahweh spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, When Pharaoh shall speak unto you, saying, Show a miracle for you, then thou shalt say unto Aaron, Take thy rod, cast it before Pharaoh, and it shall become a serpent." Okay, the word's tannin. It's the same word as dragon. "And Moses and Aaron went in unto Pharaoh, and they did so, as Yahweh had commanded, and Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent," a tannin. Verse 11, "And then Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, and now the magicians of Egypt, and they also did like manner with their enchantments, with the show of smoke and mirrors and tricks that they were able to do. They were able to produce the same animal. But what was the animal? Verse 12, "For they cast down every man his rod, and they became serpents." They became tannin. "But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods." Now, this is interesting because it's not saying the word serpent here is not the same as Moses in front of the burning bush. When he threw his rod down there, it became a serpent. It's a different word. Rotherham translates this word as a sea serpent here. Young's literal version renders it as a monster. It became a monster. And just to confirm this, let's have a look back in Exodus chapter 4, verse 2 to 4. At the occasion, at the burning bush. And Yahweh said unto him, Exodus chapter 4, verse 2, what is that in thine hand? And he said, a rod. Verse 3, and he said, cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And it's the Hebrew word nakash. And Moses fled from before it. Okay? This is the same word, right, that is used it's the Hebrew word nakash 31 times in the King James Bible, and it's always translated serpent. And it includes the serpent in Genesis chapter 3. So clearly it's a different word. So what happened in front of the burning bush, the creature that when they cast the rod down there, was a serpent. Nakash, no doubt about it. But when Moses cast the rod in Pharaoh's court, it's tannin. It's a different word. So perhaps what went on in Pharaoh's court was a lot more interesting, okay, than we think. It wasn't just snakes. It was something more interesting. And this is confirmed by Josephus' account. Josephus says concerning this in his Antiquity of the Jews, Book 2, Chapter 13, recounting this history in Pharaoh's court, and when he had said this, he cast his rod down upon the ground and commanded it to turn itself into a serpent. It obeyed him and went all around and devoured the rods of the Egyptians, which seemed to be dragons, until it had consumed them all, and it then returned it to its own form, and Moses took it all into his hands again. Well, based on and that's interesting, so that confirms it. But the Bible actually says it was dragons, okay? And they did turn into dragons. Now, if that's the case, I don't think it would have been a Tyrannosaurus Rex, okay, something huge like that in Pharaoh's court. But nevertheless, some of the sculptures that we've been looking at, a smaller version of dragon would have been possible. And it would have been a lot more exciting and a lot more dramatic what went on in Pharaoh's court. And then to see Moses' dragon consume all the other dragons would have been quite a sight. So just something to think about. Clearly two different words, okay, are used. It's not the word for serpent, it's the word for dragon in Pharaoh's court. Okay, let's move on to our reading for this afternoon, which is Job chapter 40 and verses 15 to 20. The first animal that we read off was the behemoth. So the question we first must ask, is this a metaphorical or a real animal? Is it a symbol or is it a real animal? Well, if you look at the context in Job 39, Job is relating a number of real animals, including wild goats, the ostrich, and the eagle. So the context would indicate that it's talking about a real animal. It's described in verse 15, this behemoth, as being made by God and contemporary with man. Now, I think the common view in the Brotherhood so far is that the behemoth is either a hippopotamus, or an elephant. But the problem is, how do we explain verse 17, where it says it's got its tail is like the cedar tree? So it's more likely, I think, to be the Brachiosaurus or the Apatosaurus. There's a number of names for these ones. Some people call them the Supersaurus or the Argentinosaurus, the one that's found in Argentina. Saurus, lizards, great big lizards. Okay. And let's have a look at the evidence for this. If we look again at Job 40 in these verses. Here's a quote from a newspaper, and it talks about this, naming this animal. They found the bones at the Dinosaur National Monument belong to a type of sauropod, a long-necked plant eaters, said to have been the largest animal ever to roam land. And Job here, I beg your pardon, I didn't bring that out. Now you can read it. So what Job says in chapter 40 and verse 19, he is the chief of the ways of God. The RV puts it, he is the largest and the strongest of the ways of God. And here is a large Brachiosaurus compared with a 1.8 metre tall person. Clearly, the largest and the strongest ways of God. Then it says, let's consider this again. He moves his tail like a cedar. Okay, this is a cedar tree, right? So this is huge, isn't it? A cedar tree is huge. Now, so it's got a huge tail, but it doesn't really fit an elephant, does it? Huh? What about a hippopotamus? Not really. Something's wrong. But what about this fella? That looks a lot better, doesn't it? And let's look closely at that. He makes his tail, the ESV translates it, he makes his tail stiff like a cedar. Okay, now I think the AV has it as well. If you look at the margin in verse 17, he moveth his tail like a cedar. The margin said, he setteth up his tail like a cedar. And so they found and discovered that with these large creatures, the Brachiosaurus and the Apatosaurus, the Argentinosaurus, the Supersaurus, when they they didn't just dangle their tails along. They were straight out, stiff. Okay, and so modern pictures now in modern books like these, they draw them with stiff tails, exactly as it's described here in Job. Isn't that interesting? So it wasn't until recently that modern science discovered that many of these dinosaurs would walk holding their tails like this, stiff as a beam. And they say they most likely did this for balance. They needed to counterbalance when they walked so that they would not topple over. Another says in Job 40 verse 15, he eateth grass like an ox. And then in verse 21, he lieth under the shady trees in the covert of the reed and fens. And so you'll often find pictures of these animals. They found them dwelling in rivers or shallow areas where reeds were. And it's also a description by the way of a herbivore, isn't it? In verse 16, lo now his strength is in his loins and his force is in the navel of his belly. Okay, this animal is huge. It's describing a bulky bodied animal. The shady trees covered him, verse 22, with their shadow. The willows of the brook encompass him about. I mean, there's so many pictures like this where you find this, the paleontologists and historians, just the evolutionary viewpoint, they say this is the environment in which this creature lived. Now, if we have a look at verse 18, it says, his bones are as strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. Well, that's interesting. Now, here's what one man in America has done. He set up this especially. Basically, he had one bone, one fossil. I think it's the one he's holding. And from the dimensions of that, he was able to extrapolate the rest of the leg. Okay? Look at the size of it. Okay? And so it confirms what Job is saying. His bones are as strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. So to support 100 tons of weight, his bones would have to be extremely strong. So I think there's a lot of evidence, don't you agree, that Job 40, verse 15 to the end, the behemoth is actually talking about one of these supersauruses or ultrasauruses. Let's move on to the Leviathan. Now this is a bit harder. It's been a bit harder for me to come to grips to what type of animal this could be. It's quite an interesting study in this chapter. And the Hebrew word, Leviathan, okay? And we've actually been reading it a few times so far. It's mentioned together with dragon often. It's from a word, lava, which means to twine, to cleave, to join. Strong says it's a wreathed animal, that is a serpent, especially a crocodile or some other large sea monster. And the word wreathed here is in the sense of, means to circle or encircle, to surround. Brown Driver Briggs says it's a sea monster, a dragon, a large aquatic animal, perhaps the extinct dinosaur or the Plesiosaurus. And in the King James Bible, it occurs 5 times, and 6 times, and on 5 occasions it's Leviathan, and in Job 3 verse 8 it's translated as mourning, in the sense as, look, if you raise this creature up, you'll be dead, you'll be mourning, people will be mourning for you. It's so fearful. Now, okay, other references. In Job 3 verse 8, it says, let them curse it that curse the day, who are ready to raise up their mourning. In other words, those who are ready to rouse up the Leviathan. And in chapter 41 verse 8, the chapter we read, it says, no one is so fierce that he dares to arouse him. Psalm 74 verse 14, thou breakest the heads of the Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. We already read that to point out this was a great work that God did that humans can't do. And then Psalm 104 verse 26, there go the ships. There is that Leviathan whom thou madest to play therein. So this isn't symbology, is it? The word is used to talk about a real animal, just like ships are real in the water. The Leviathan is there as well. God made this creature to play therein. Isaiah 27 verse 1, in the day that Yahweh with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, that piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. This verse symbolic, but based on literal. Now, if we come to specifically to have a look at how this creature is described in Job 41, it's a creature that lived in the water, at least partially. And we know that from verse 1, it says, can you draw him out with a hook? Right? Talking about fishing. Can you go fishing and catch this one? Verse 7 refers to fishing spears. Verse 31, we have references to this creature being in the deep, in the sea. So it's clearly a creature that can live in the water. Verse 1 to 5 says it could not be captured. Verse 6 to 17, the summary of that is that man could not kill it for food. But the psalm says God did it. In verse 18 to 22, his breath kindled coals and fire came out of his mouth. Now that's interesting. I'll talk about that in a second. And his skin was too tough for spears or arrows. And his belly is like sharp stones. Potsherds in the ASV translation. In other words, like broken pieces of pottery. And verse 29 to 34 say he was the king of the beasts. Now, a lot of translations and a lot of people studying this suggest that this animal is the crocodile. But you think about that, well, it can't be the crocodiles we know. Because you can capture them. You can throw a spear through it, right? You can kill it for food. Its skins, it's tough, but still, spears and arrows will break through it. So it can't be a crocodile. Well, what about Brown Driver Briggs' suggestion before of a Plesiosaurus or a Kronosaurus? Is another word. This is the family of the Pliosaur or the Kronosaurus. You can see how huge they were. Great big creatures, weren't they? Bigger than a whale, even bigger than a T-Rex. Just enormous creatures. But the problem with this is that the Leviathan, we read in Job 41, is not restricted to the ocean. It's able to travel on the land as well. Read carefully, verse 30. His underparts are like sharp potsherds, and he spreads out like a threshing sledge on the mire. So it's telling us about a creature that can walk on the mire, on the mud, if you like. Okay? The NIV says he leaves a trail in the mud like a threshing sledge. So it's obviously a creature in the sea that's able to come out of the water, isn't it? So what type of creature are we talking about? Now, I think a crocodile is the right idea, okay? But a very different crocodile from what we're acquainted with. This one is called a Sarasuchus. It was a huge crocodile, absolutely huge. And here we have the diagram of it. The smaller size of this Sarasuchus compared to a 1.8 metre tall person. And we read in Job 41 verse 15 that his scales are his pride. They're shut up together as with a close seal. His back is made of rows of shields. Can you see the picture here? This was from a National Geographic article on the Sarasuchus, the picture. Look at the shielded armour, okay? From its neck all the way down, through its body, all the way through its tail. And they call these bony plates that it had osteoderms, okay? The largest of which were 1 metre or 3 feet long. And scientifically they referred to them as scutes. And they served as armour above the skeleton that would have helped support its great mass, okay, but also restricted its flexibility. So Job 41 verse 13 says, who can strip off his outer armour? Who can come within his double mail? I mean, this is accurately describing this creature. And here's a diagram of how these bony plates, okay, or scutes worked. You can see here it's got the main skeleton running down the spine, but on top of that it had these bony plates or scutes all the way down. And so the National Geographic article said, gorgeous armour, describing this creature, mused paleontologist Hans Larsen, examining a stack of foot-long bony scutes that looked like roofing tiles. These would have provided an impermeable shield over the supercroc's neck, back and tail. Interesting, isn't it? Okay. Now, there's another interesting thing too. It says in Job chapter 41, verse 31 to 32, I'm quoting the NASB here, it says, he makes the depths boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a jar of ointment. Behind him he makes a wave, a path to shine. One would think the deep to be grey-haired or white. What's that talking about? Well, think about boiling water and the agitation that has occurred. If you have a small bucket, you can easily create agitation in the water. But in the ocean, God is saying that this creature agitates the level of the water, like a boiling pot. He makes the sea like a jar of ointment, just a little jar of ointment or water that you can make turbulence in. This is what this creature does in the sea. And then it says, behind him he makes a wake, a path to shine. What's that talking about? Well, you think about a speedboat. What does it do when it speeds along? What goes behind? A path, doesn't it? Okay? The foam of the water, the turbulence of the water as it goes. And then it says, one would think the deep to be grey-haired. Other translations have it white. Okay? You see what it's describing? Isn't this amazing? This animal in the water was so fast and furious. Just think of a speedboat going along and the white foam exploding out the back through the ocean as this beast moves along. And this is Job's describing it. One would think the deep to have grey hair or white hair. It's turning the water into white foam. So it would have created a massive trail of turbulence and bubbles as it plunged into the water and swam. Now this is the size of its head, okay, compared to a human. In verse 14 of Job 41 it says, "Who can open the doors of his face? Around his teeth there is terror." Here's another picture. This huge jaw contained 132 thick teeth. Scientists describe them like railroad spikes, and it was formidable. Okay, they could slash, they could hold, they could grab. Okay, and the amount of force that they could exert, the amount of pressure that they could exert to crush something, okay, was enormous. It would be very difficult that once you got caught in its mouth that you could ever get away. And that would be other dinosaurs as well. Now there's another interesting aspect about the Sarasuchus, and that's here what's described, the nose area. There's a cavity, a large cavity area. The National Geographic article describes that the swollen end of the snout houses an enormous cavity under the nostrils, meaning this croc may have had an enhanced sense of smell and a most unusual call. That's possible. An unexplained bulb, but we don't know. They're saying they don't know. They're just suggesting that's what that huge cavity was there for. So it's got this unexplained bulbous snout with an enormous cavity. Well, perhaps this is the answer to the words we debate most about in this chapter when considering the Leviathan, is the words about in verse 19 to 21. How did it produce fire? Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goes smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. Now, just think about this for the moment, okay? Is it impossible that some dinosaurs could have breathed fire? Now, one example here is a Parasaurolophus. And here it is a picture. And you look at the cone on its head, like a horn back. And at first they thought with this particular creature that it must be for fishing, like a snorkel. It could go through the water and keep breathing and eat fish to its heart's content. But they proved that wrong because there's no hole in it. There was no area for air to get in and for it to breathe. And so one possibility for this particular creature was that was used as a combustion chamber to produce fire. Now this may sound a bit radical or extreme at first to think that this was possible, but we're dealing with what the Bible says actually happened. And Job is describing literal creatures and what they could do. Now if we look around at animals today, we may be able to, our understanding may be helped that certain dinosaurs may have been able to breathe fire. Has anyone heard of the bombardier beetle? Okay. Have you seen a YouTube? You just go home and enter this on YouTube and look at a video of what the bombardier beetle can do to destroy or frighten away a spider 5 times, 10 times its size. Okay? It has an enormous ability for its size to produce a hot ray of gas, hydrogen peroxide, a lethal mix that absolutely terrifies any creature that comes close to it. Now, how God can create this in a little tiny beast, this ability, why can't he create it in a big beast as well? There's other examples, the electric eel. Okay? Does anyone know how much, if you touch one of these, what's the voltage charge you're going to get? 400 volts. Okay? A shock of 400 volts is what you'll get. Okay? And it's amazing that when two of them are mating, they're giving off that shock of 400 volts, but they don't destroy each other. Wonderfully made, fearfully and wonderfully made are the creatures of God. But here's another example of enormous power that God has given an animal that we would think strange, but he's done it. What about the spitting cobra? Okay, it's able to spit out a venomous ray directly into the eyes of the animal or even humans who is approaching it. So the point here is, we can see in nature around today evidence that God has provided certain animals, with ability to give a strong shock, a strong flame of gas. Okay, so if Job describes in Job 41 the Leviathan as able to breathe fire, then I think we have to believe it and say that yes, this could actually happen. Okay, and the historical evidence and the legend evidence will confirm that around the world, that they speak about these creatures being able to breathe fire. So again, Job 41 verse 19 to 21, out of his mouth goeth burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out of his nostrils goeth smoke as of a seething pot of cauldron, his breath kindleth coals, and flame goeth out of his mouth. Okay? It's not acceptable just to symbolise this away. It's speaking about a literal creature. God created, okay, this creature with this ability. Okay? And it's described as one of the most fearful creatures that God made. So that's very interesting, isn't it? Just before we wrap up this afternoon's study, a question is often raised, well, okay, even these creatures right in Job, we're dealing with after the flood, aren't we? So how did they fit on Noah's Ark? Well, this question is often raised. You know, the ark was 15 metres high, and some adult sauropods would have been up to 17 metres high when lying prostrate. And you think about all the different dinosaur kinds and species. Again, we have to listen to what the Bible says. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 20, it says that 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. Okay? And that includes the dragons. So the point is, I think, that they didn't have to take them fully grown onto the ark. You know, they could have been young. They could just babies. And another people argue that all Noah needed to do in certain cases was to take the shell, the eggs on board. So this was possible. Another important thing is not all dinosaurs were big. And so the largest started out small, even the largest started out small. Then they argue that, the evolutionary point of view, that there's too many types of dinosaurs to fit on Noah's Ark. So, for example, with the big, huge beasts, the behemoth that we considered in Job 40, the Apatosaurus, and there's the Diplodocus, there's the Supersaurus, there's the Argentinosaurus. How are you going to fit all them on? There's too many. Well, you see, the answer to that is that when Noah was told to bring all the animals, he wasn't told to bring all the species on board. He was told to bring of every living flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring to the ark, to keep them alive, male and female, of fowls after their kind. Okay, not every species. Of cattle after their kind. Okay, so with dogs or cats, he didn't have to bring every breed and species of dogs. He just needed 2 dogs. With cats, he just needed 2 cats. Okay? Didn't have to bring everything on board that we see around us in the world today. And so, they're different species, but the same kind. So, for example, in the Ceratopsia world, you have different species, but it's the same kind. And when it comes down to it, there's only about 50 dinosaur kinds that Noah needed to bring on the ark. Another really interesting thing about the flood is dinosaur footprints and eggs. All over the world, there are dinosaur footprints, okay, that they find. Not just dinosaur fossils of their bones, but dinosaur footprints. Now, how can you have a dinosaur footprint preserved in the rock all over the world, in different places? And there's also eggs as well, with the unborn embryo still there. How on earth did that happen? So here's an example of, dinosaur footprints. And notice it's straight too. They're not wandering around. Wherever these sites where they uncover the dinosaur footprints are there, the dinosaur footprints, it's like it's running straight, in a straight line. But the explanation here is what happened during the flood. Okay? Now often we think of the flood as the waters gradually rising, okay, in a very straight line. But in actual fact, when you think about it, there would have been plate tectonics, okay? There would have been tsunamis occurring all over the world. There would have been the lunar tides pulling things. There would have been the slow uplifting of the crust as the fountains of the deep were open. So it wasn't, and I don't think this comes out clearly on the slide here, I don't know if you can see it, but what it's suggesting is that the way the water would have risen is it went up and down and up and down, okay? So what the dinosaurs would have done is they would have fled to the higher ground. And the smaller or the younger dinosaurs would have been destroyed first, but the bigger ones would have survived. And so to cut this short, the ground, from all the rain and everything going on, would have been very muddy. So they put their footprint in there. And then not long after that, the tsunami would come in bringing huge sediment, right, and cover their footprint. Okay? So what that would mean then is that their footprint would be preserved in sediment. So that later on, as we see today, that eventually when a rock face is eroded due to wind and various weather effects, these footprints are revealed. So I think I'm just trying to say that the footprints and the eggs are the same, really, is evidence of a global flood. There's no other way that dinosaur footprints and even soft, fragile eggs could be preserved. They were rapidly buried, rapidly covered. Okay? I'm sorry I rushed that a bit, but I hope you get the point. So let's conclude here. God created dragons, dinosaurs at the same time he created all other creatures 6,000 years ago. Soft tissue and red blood cells found in fossilized dinosaur bones proves that dinosaurs can't be 65 million years old. Archaeological and historic evidence prove that dinosaurs and man were contemporary. And we're going to see this in the next session, that legends of dragons, dinosaurs from all around the world verifies this. And the fossil record is a witness to the rapid burial of animals, including dinosaurs, which occurred at the time of Noah's flood. The Bible describes two types of dragons in detail in the book of Job. Dragons were probably more numerous prior to the flood. Noah would have taken small dragons or dragon eggs into the ark. There's only 55 dinosaur kinds. Dragons became extinct during the 1700s and 1800s as man hunted and destroyed those remaining. It's interesting, the encyclopedias we quoted at the outset of the first study are describing small dragons. So in the 1700s, all that was left is the smaller ones, because what went extinct first were the big ones, because man hunted them first. The theory of evolution and the lie that dinosaurs existed 65 million years ago continues to deceive many people away from believing the truth of the Bible. Let's not be deceived.